Thanks for the invitation, and thanks also for your efforts in bringing this together. It's amazing. I don't know if some of you know, but Milan wrote me this morning and said more than 500 people have signed up. And so that's a great effort. And I'm very happy to be here with all of you. So let's take advantage then of having an extra 5 minutes of time to dive in. I've decided today to be a little ambitious, considering Milan's reason for inviting me. So this is a conference about integral approaches, and I enjoy to speak a lot from that perspective, but I wanted to offer you something that is reasonably practical today, with the hope that it's going to, number one, inspire you, and secondly, inform you, and three, maybe give you some ideas about concrete things that you can go away with today and start applying elsewhere in situations where you're working together in an organization with others, or any context where there's a need to collaborate together around common objectives somehow. So with that said, I'm going to opt for a presentation today to try and use some visuals to just help convey a little more the topics I want to cover. And I'm going to aim to give you a kind of 101 on something called Sociocracy 3.0. And the subtitle for my talk today was Creating Conditions for People and Organization to Thrive. Anyone who's paying attention probably realizes that an organization can't really thrive if the people aren't thriving too, but nonetheless, sometimes people are prepared to accept kind of lesser outcomes, even though that might be sometimes to the detriment of people who are involved. So Sociocracy 3.0 is something that was created by myself, Bernard Bokelbrink, and Lily David. And I'm going to talk a bit about what that is, give a little bit of background about how we got to Sociocracy 3.0, and then kind of break it down into some component parts to give you some ideas about what you can do to help generate these kinds of conditions where it's more likely that people and organization can thrive somehow. So with that said, then let's move on. The word sociocracy you may or may not have heard of, but certainly most of you have heard of the word democracy. Many say sociocracy is a form of democracy, and it's derived from the term socius, like social group, and kratos, which means power or rule. So one way to think about sociocracy is rule by the social group. So if you think about self-organization, if you think about self-management, if you think about end-to-end delivery within cross-functional teams, etc., then already you're looking at a kind of social system that's enabled somehow to be able to make decisions and create value for themselves. One key component around sociocracy in its modern day interpretation is that people who are affected by decisions can make or at least influence those decisions on the basis of reasons for doing so. And sociocracy in general is an approach to governance that invites people to at least be reasonable. So I'm going to say a bit more about what I mean by that. So there's a long history to the word sociocracy. It was first coined by Auguste Comte in 1851. I think a lot of Comte's ideas were quite controversial. I don't agree with some of them. Comte was quite anti-democracy. He was concerned that it was open to manipulation. I don't think he was entirely wrong about that fact. He also anticipated that in future, societies would need to be or would benefit from being governed in a more scientific and reasonable way. But his view was that societies should be governed by social scientists who made decisions based or using the scientific method for the well-being of the people. So there's some controversy there in some of his ideas, but that's the origins of the term, at least. And sociocracy went through a number of kind of iterations in terms of its evolution. Lester Frank Ward looked more toward the meaning of the word, like rule by the social group. What does that look like? And he was a strong advocate for democracy. And then Case Bucher, and I should mention Betty Cadbury here as well, from the Cadbury family. They were activists, and in the 1920s, they founded a school in the Netherlands, taking this idea of rule by the social group to enable children to take responsibility for governance within the school alongside the adults. So it was a kind of decentralizing responsibility for governance of the system among everybody. And that school still exists to this day in the Netherlands, in fact, and still applies a lot of Betty's and Case's early thinking. So most people who've heard of sociocracy have heard of the Sociocratic circle method. And this was developed in the 70s by Gerard Endenberg, an engineer in an electrical company in the Netherlands. I'm not going to go into details around that today, but I will reference back at points through this talk. Roll forward to the mid-noughties, Brian Robertson, who developed holacracy. If you look under the hood of holacracy, there's a lot of influence there from the Sociocratic circle method. And then in 2014, 15, I met with Bernard Bockelbrink and Lily David to create S3. And in a nutshell, S3, or Sociocracy 3.0, is a social technology for developing agile and resilient organizations. And I want to explain what I mean by that. So a few characteristics worth knowing. It's versatile and adaptable. It supports an iterative and incremental approach to organizational development. So not just product and service development, but how you evolve the organization as well. And all resources that we create and share on the Sociocracy 30 website are available under a Creative Commons license. The reason for that is because for us, it was really important that nothing stood in the way of the free transmission of these technologies. So another way to think of it is a menu of patterns. And when I say patterns, I mean practices, processes, and guidelines that you can use for successfully navigating specific contexts. And these aren't patterns that we made up, rather they're based on observation of human beings in collaboration. And if you look back historically over time, you see that certain practices, processes evolved through the need to collaborate and cooperate together, and they prevailed because of their usefulness in certain contexts some of the time. So S3 provides a menu of patterns, but patterns that can also be adapted and evolved to suit specific contexts. If you visit the website or elsewhere, you're going to see this illustration, which shows the current kind of ordering of patterns in terms of different categories. Patterns for building organizations, for making sense of things and decision-making, patterns for defining agreements, peer development, and so on. And there's also 7 principles, which I'm going to mention briefly, and you're welcome to go and read more about that on the Sociocracy 30 site. But I want to introduce them because they're kind of the underpinning thread, if you like, that weaves the fabric of the patterns together. So equivalence is about involving people in making and evolving decisions that affect them. Consent, I'll come to this in more detail later, but it's about raising, seeking out, and resolving objections to decisions and actions. This is really pulling on Comp's early thinking around the idea of bringing more empiricism and reasonableness into decision-making. Transparency, so having important information recorded and accessible to people throughout the organization, unless there's a reason not to. Accountability, which from our perspective means doing what you've agreed to. So if you take responsibility for something, you become accountable somehow. Recognizing that accountability is shared throughout an organization. Everybody carries some responsibility for the organization. So having that in mind as well. Effectiveness. Another way of looking at effectiveness really is just like making the best with the limited time, energy, and resources that you have. Life's short and precious. So how do we make the best of it? And empiricism and continuous improvement. So testing hypotheses, running experiments, especially in complex contexts, and using what's learned to be able to continuously improve. So why Sociocracy 3.0? One question that Bernard asked me when I first met him was, have you seen many examples of organizations that adopted something like the Sociocratic circle method, and over the years just persisted with exactly that? And my answer was no. And so he then pushed a little more and invited me to reflect on what people actually did. And I said, well, what people do is they take what they think works, They adjust things if they think it would be better to adjust them, and they abandon anything that doesn't work, basically. So in the end, people tend to do their own thing and just take things that might seem useful. And it was really on this basis that we decided that we would work toward looking at what are some of the common patterns you can find in various frameworks, Agile frameworks, Lean-inspired frameworks, and the Sociocratic circle method that might be worth documenting independently so people can pull them in according to need. So we realized every context is unique and there are no one-size-fits-all solutions. We wanted to provide people with patterns that they could consider when their habitual ways of doing things failed to bring about the results they expected or wished to see. We based S3 very much on many frameworks that you would find in the world today. So you can build popular scaling frameworks like SAFe, Holacracy, the S3 Sociocratic circle method, and so on, using S3 patterns. But you can also develop your own unique approach as well. And one final thing I want to just mention at this stage is that from my point of view, bringing greater consciousness into what we do is fundamental in our ability to learn and improve. And so whether or not a particular pattern from S3 or from anywhere else for that matter is useful for you or not, at that interface between the habitual and what's new, there's a potential for greater consciousness to be attained somehow. So simply by virtue of seeing something play out differently to how you would play it out yourself gives you an opportunity to become more conscious of yourself as well. So for this talk, what I'm going to do is to structure what I have to share a bit around 6 key concepts that we've used in Sociocracy 3.0. And the advantage of concepts is that they can help to provide a common language. They can increase shared understanding. And they also support or enable more constructive dialogue as well, through bringing some kind of coherence to how we interact with each other, make sense of things, determine meaning, and decide how to respond. So the concepts I'm going to be talking about are driver, domain, governance, operations, objection, and agreement. So driver, first of all, when I say driver, I don't mean somebody who drives the bus. I'm talking about a person or a group's motive for responding to a specific situation. Okay, so you've probably heard from different people's points of view these days the importance of clarifying the why. So driver is the why. You and I make on average 30,000 decisions every day. And for every one of those decisions, there's a presumed driver for why we are deciding what we decide. Okay, so you are a driver spotting entity, and I'm going to come back and say more about that soon. The second concept I want to introduce for now is domain. And when I say domain, once again, this is something that's familiar to you, but you might not have thought of it in this way before. I mean, a distinct area of influence, activity, and decision-making within an organization. So if you're responsible for a particular role, or maybe a number of roles, maybe you're part of a team, maybe you're delivering a project, a product, a service, perhaps, any area of work that you can conceive of within an organizational setting can be categorized as what we're referring to as a domain. HR, admin, sales, cleaning, etc. Okay. Now, the reason I'm introducing this to you is because I'd like to build a story, starting with the beginning of an organization. So what we see here is 3 folks who are kicking off some kind of collaboration together. And what we see here is the domain of their collaboration. And we can add into this the driver, right? There's a reason why an individual or a group of people start an organization to begin with. There's something happening and needed that they think is important, and they decide to use their time, energy, and resources to respond. And as with all good ideas, it usually turns out being a bit more complicated than people first thought. So over time, a number of other drivers become important too. And at some point, if demand expands in terms of requirements on those 3 people, then it's possible that they might then clarify a subdomain within the organization, and then having clarified that, delegate responsibility to others who come and take responsibility for that subdomain. Okay, we're basically talking about hiring here, bringing people on board, inviting others to join your collaboration, and so on. I say we clarify the domain because in my experience, the amount of time and energy that goes into clarifying a domain is sometimes less than might be useful, or there's some kind of discrepancy between what the job description says versus what people actually end up taking responsibility for. But the general practice is delegating influence to others to be able to expand your scope or capacity to get things done. And in an ideal world, in my opinion at least, it's a clear contract. So delegatees take responsibility. They know what they're taking responsibility for. And delegators provide the necessary support and opportunities for development to delegatees as well. It's a contract, right? It's an agreement to work together to be able to achieve more than these people could maybe achieve alone. To help with that, in S3, one of the patterns that we've documented is one we've called clarify and develop domains. We've got a template with a number of different components that we think are useful to consider clarifying, but there may be others as well. The key point here is that when responsibility is delegated within an organization, it's really helpful, 1, to be clear on expectations, but 2, to be clear on any important constraints that need to be considered, what resources might be appropriate, how success is measured, what are key metrics, how will the work be monitored, and so on. And there's obviously many ways that this is happening in the world today, but what excites me about the idea of making a domain clear and explicit is the idea of evolving it based on learning over time. Okay, so one way to think of domains are enabling constraints. They enable the people who take responsibility for that area of work to be able to create value in the most effective way. And our first guess often about what might be a suitable set of constraints isn't necessarily always correct. So by regularly evaluating outcomes and evaluating the design of the domain, it can be evolved between delegator and delegatee over time with the express purpose of really enabling those people who have responsibility for it to do the very best work that they can. So if we've got domains clarified, there's a number of ways in organizations that people account for domains, but the most common ones are with a role. So somebody in a role taking responsibility for a domain, or some kind of team. And in S3, we document 3 types of team: a circle, a helping team, and an open domain. I'm not going to go into details about helping team or open domain today, but I'm going to come back to circle soon because it's probably a term some of you have heard of and it's often misunderstood. Another role that often shows up in organizations of any scale is the representative. So somebody who goes from one domain to another domain to be able to kind of carry information, to bring influence, and to be able to participate, especially in matters of dependency that extend across domains. And this idea of linking between domains is actually known as linking or double linking in many contexts today. So these in S3 are the building blocks for organizations. There are other ways, of course, to account for domains like automation, AI. Recently, I was in a call and I made a joke about a donkey can be a way to account for a domain. And you wouldn't believe it, but ironically, one of the people on the call was actually on a farm and there was a donkey just outside their door. So there are other ways to take care of these things, but generally teams and roles are the way that we're familiar with today. So I'm really impressed in the world today about the number of innovative ways people are putting these building blocks together and structuring organizations to be able to meet the variety of challenges and opportunities that organizations face. In S3, when we launched S3, we documented a number of structural patterns, but I'm actually looking forward to updating this soon because there's many others that we haven't mentioned here that I think are really notable and worth considering today. For example, Rendan-Hay would be one, market-based dynamics would be another, and there's many more besides this too. But the basic idea around structuring organizations isn't to implement some blueprint according to some archaic way of organizing people, but rather to think, how can we structure a system to enable the flow of information and the distribution of influence throughout the system in a way that maximally enables everybody to create value throughout that organizational system. Right? Personally, I find that a really catalytic way of thinking about organizational structure. And that's not a question you answer once, but it's a question that you're answering every day. So whatever our preferred or current structure for organization, the question is, how do you, as you grow, maintain agility and responsiveness to changing contexts throughout the system and make sure that challenges and opportunities are quickly identified and addressed appropriately somehow? So this brings in another pattern that we've documented in S3. It's called navigate via tension. So what we mean by tension is some kind of inner state of alert. So your heart's racing, your stomach's tight, your legs are clenched, your mind is racing. Yeah. Anytime we perceive a situation that appears to be different to the situation we would prefer or expect to see, then we will experience tension internally somehow. And unless there's a secondary reason for ignoring that tension, which, to be honest, most of us do in some ways every day, but if you catch the fact that that inner alarm is ringing, it gives you the opportunity to be able to identify, what is it I'm perceiving here? Why does that matter somehow? So navigate via tension is an invitation to pause between that stimulus and response. You know, very often we'll just react to a situation to attempt to change it if it's different to how we expect or wish. But navigate via tension is inviting as a first step to really pause and to ask ourselves, okay, having noticed this tension, why am I experiencing tension in this way? Okay, so really bringing attention to what it is that we perceive before we act. Another important question is it relevant? You know, we experience tension for all kinds of things, but is it relevant in the context in which we're involved right now? Is it relevant in the context of our work in the organization? And if it is, then a good question to ask is, who's responsible for dealing with this kind of thing? If it sounds like I'm laying out the obvious here, I am, because these are like basic fundamental human behaviors. But the thing is about whether or not you're doing this consciously. Okay, what does it look like if we bring more consciousness to each of these steps so that we can do it in a more considered and intentional way? Obviously, if you can deal with things yourself, do. But otherwise, you need to know who you might pass it on to so that they can figure out how to respond to that in some way. And so having responded, it's also useful to bring a bit of that agile mindset into how you proceed to regularly evaluate and evolve outcomes so that you can adapt based on what you learn. So let's break these down a little bit. I'm going to run through these different steps and use them as a kind of secondary layer to build a few key points on. So coming back to driver, this was the first concept I mentioned alongside domain, the motive for responding to a situation. I'm going to give you an example of a driver from a customer from some time ago. Okay, so there's a brief summary here. Information is unstructured, it's kept in silos and sometimes unrecorded, leading to inability to understand and contribute to the whole picture. We need relevant information to be shared proactively to be able to provide the necessary customer solutions. Okay, so this was a real situation, maybe one that's familiar to some of you here. And this team had responsibility for dealing with this in some way. So I'm giving you the example to show how, in a very condensed way, you can describe what's happening and what's needed. And if we look at that description there for a moment, we can see it's broken down into 4 parts. There's the current situation, which is information is unstructured, kept in silos, and sometimes unrecorded. So it's objective. There's no judgment, there's no blames. It's a very clear description of the situation as objectively as possible. We can see the effect, or sometimes the anticipated effect on the organization. So this was leading to inability to understand and contribute to the whole picture. What was needed, or rather what's deficit, as another way of thinking about that, is that relevant information is shared proactively. You see, there's no solution there. It doesn't say how to do that. It just says there's an absence of adequate shared information being shared proactively. And finally, the anticipated impact were that need to be responded to provide the necessary customer solutions, or to be able to provide the necessary customer solutions. This pattern, describe organizational drivers, is one that people seem, once they understand it, to become very excited about, because it's interesting when you have a conversation with someone else about what you're perceiving, why you think it matters, and what you think might be needed, you often discover that people have a different perspective to you. And because everything we do is in response to drivers, it can really pay to take the time to kind of get a second perspective in matters of significance, to bring a team together. And before you start deciding what to do about something, to make sure you're in agreement about what that something actually is and why it matters first. Okay. So it's obviously important as well in the context of an organization to just respond to drivers that are relevant for the organization. And it's quite simple, really, to figure out how to make that determination. You just need to ask, is it going to help the organization if we respond to this driver? Or will it harm the organization in some way if we don't? If the answer to either of those questions is yes, then it's an organizational driver. You see, it's not about, is this an important organizational driver? That can come later. The first question is it relevant? Period. And if it is, then once it arrives on the backlog of those people who are responsible for it, they can determine importance. They can prioritize it somehow. And of course, if it's not relevant to the organization, then get it out of the way, because it's just going to be waste. So building on to this, this question of who's responsible. So if domains are clear, and I'm not talking about every single detail being clarified regarding who's responsible for what, I'm talking about the minimal necessary explanation and constraints to maximally enable people to get on with doing stuff, okay? So if a driver shows up and it's within my domain, my area of influence, activity, and decision-making, then obviously I'm going to prioritize that and deal with it somehow. On the other hand, very often, I don't know about you, but for me, I bump into situations that would benefit from a response. It's not really on my job spec, but that's not the point, really. If I can deal with it myself, then I'm going to do that if it doesn't lead to undesirable consequences. Okay, so this isn't a criticism people sometimes have of clarifying areas of responsibility, is that people then don't take responsibility for everything else. But I prefer to look at it the other way. We're responsible for everything unless there's somebody specifically who can take responsibility for something somehow. But of course, if it's beyond the scope of what you can handle for whatever reason, then you will do what ideally happens in all organizations, is pass information about that driver onto a team somehow, or someone who has a role. So when a driver arrives into a team or to someone in a role, there's a couple of ways basically that people are going to respond. One of them is to either organize work somehow around this driver, or just get on and do something. We call this operations. And the other is to make some kind of decision somehow about how to respond to a driver like that. And this is what we refer to as governance. And that brings us to these next two concepts in S3, governance and operations. So governance, what we mean by that is this act of setting objectives and making and evolving decisions that guide people toward achieving those objectives. And operations, we're referring to doing the actual work and organizing the daily activities within the constraints defined through governance. So in terms of telling the difference, the thing to remember with governance is it's like building the banks of the river. It's like when you make a governance decision, it's going to constrain somehow future decisions and actions in some way. And whenever you make a decision that will constrain future decisions and actions of yourself and or other people as well, then that's consequential. And so it pays to keep paying attention to that, to test outcomes from that decision, to test outcomes from those constraints, to see whether or not that decision can be improved over time. It's like building the banks of the river to guide the creative flow. But if the water flows where you don't want it to, you want to be able to pick that up fast and adjust the design of those riverbanks so that it can more optimally flow where you need. So in terms of telling the difference between governance and operations, it's good just to check whether or not response to a driver is covered by a previous decision. If it is, then you're just going to get it into an operations board. And if it's not, but it's just some kind of one-off decision, it's not going to govern future decisions and actions, then it's an operational thing too. But if it's something that's going to have a consequence on future decisions and actions somehow, then this is governance. And in any organizational system, you need to handle governance of that system somehow, both globally across the system and also locally as well. And governance really is a form or a feature of organizational management. So if we're looking to distribute power to influence through organizational systems to people who take responsibility for specific domains, and if we design those domains to free those people up to create value as effectively as possible for themselves, then it's likely that part of the responsibility those people will have will be for governance within that domain as well. So I'm not going to go into details about this, but just to mention patterns for organizing work in S3. I explained that S3 is really a documentation of several patterns that you find out there in the world. And there's a few that really I have to kind of accredit to people who've been working in the field of Agile and Lean for many years, visualizing work, backlogs, prioritizing backlogs, the idea of a pull system for work rather than pushing work onto people, limiting work in progress, planning meetings and review meetings, daily stand-ups, retrospectives, and so on. I'm not going to go into details to those today, but if you're unfamiliar with them, do check them out because it's really just a phenomenally simple but phenomenally powerful tool set for organizing and delivering work. But where I do want to focus for the last part of this talk today is on the topic of collaborative decision-making. So I said I would come back to Gerard Endenberg, who I mentioned at the start of this talk, the creator of the Sociocratic Circle method. One feature of SCM that is really notable was his idea to shift from managed teams to a pattern that we call circle in S3. So a circle is a group of people who don't only have operational responsibility within their domain, but they have responsibility for governance within their domain as well. And I think this is an awesome pattern because it enables someone, if they are in a leadership position within a team, to bring all of their wisdom and experience, but it also enables harnessing distributed intelligence of other people who are involved as well. Obviously, collaborative decision-making has an overhead, always. So it's a good question to ask when and why would you co-create to begin with? One obvious answer is when you're responding to complex issues, because it's useful to harness a diversity of perspectives. You might also anyway want to harness diversity. You might want dissent to actually attract disagreement or to seek novelty. But another often overlooked component is that you're going to increase ownership of decisions that are made. If you make a decision that affects me, it will always be your decision that affected me. If we make a decision together, then it will be our decision, not just yours. And increased ownership of decisions helps to raise engagement and self-accountability as well. So whilst making decisions collaboratively is useful, in my opinion, all governance within organizations should be seeking to free each individual up to create value as much as possible for themselves. So effective collaborative governance shouldn't lead to more and more need for collaborative governance. We're making decisions with governance to guide future decisions and actions to free people up to be able to get stuff done and create value for themselves. And that brings us to the last couple of concepts that I wanted to share with you today. The first one being agreement. Many people say an organization is a living system, but an organization is also a body of agreements that have been made between people. And in general, we define agreements in S3 as any agreed upon guideline, process, protocol, or policy designed to guide the flow of value. And to help with making good enough agreements, the other concept that I want to share with you is the concept of objection. And when I say objection, I mean any argument that demonstrates or reveals how a proposed agreement or activity will lead to unintended consequences you want to avoid, could lead to consequences you want to avoid and you don't want to take that risk, or an argument that demonstrates a worthwhile way to improve something as well. And these two concepts are relevant to a pattern that some of you might be familiar with, consent decision-making. So consent decision-making sees objections as gifts. Any argument that reveals unintended consequences or worthwhile ways to improve is seen as worth hearing. And maybe for some of you, you were schooled in the practice of not arguing with people, of not raising objections, whereas consent decision-making really turns that on its head. It's inviting people to be proactive in raising, seeking out, and resolving objections to decisions and actions, and checking among people for any possible objections or no objection, and sometimes concerns. A decision for which there are no further objections is really a decision that's good enough for now and safe enough to try. And if we bring that agile perspective to making and evolving agreements, then it's important to treat decisions of significance as experiments, ideally to design them in a way where they're safe to fail, and to really pay attention to the consequences of our actions so that we can apply learning iteratively and incrementally as things proceed. Okay, so this brings me to a final couple of points I wanted to share with you. The first one was not as a prescription for a particular way to proceed, but if you're involved in an organization and you're looking at alternatives to a management hierarchy to handle management of certain areas of the organization that might also harness more distributed intelligence and bring more ownership and engagement as well, then one pattern that we documented in S3, a structural pattern, is called the Delegate circle. And the way it works basically is when you have a number of operational domains, each team selects representatives who come together to take responsibility for governance of areas of dependency across those different domains. So very similar to the function of a management team, but in this case, it's bringing the responsibility for governance to members of those teams who are selected as representatives to handle this for some period of time. Okay, the final thing I wanted to share on this topic today was to introduce the idea of discovery and emergence. I was saying earlier that there are many ways that organizations are structured today, and there's a lot of wisdom in the way that people put organizations together. But it's very difficult to predict precisely what's necessary and what's valuable in any given moment. And this is true for organizational structure as much as anything else in organizations today. So if you imagine we have a structure where people are navigating via attention, they're paying attention to situations that are different to what they expect or wish to see. There's some clarity over who's responsible for what, and drivers are being passed to people in the relevant domains. Then over time, work is done and decisions are made. And this leads to many outcomes, including an evolution of the organizational structure as it's continuously been adapted and evolved to respond to whatever important drivers are arising in the context of the organization. So S3 is supporting much more of an emergent approach where people act more like stewards of the system and harnessing distributed intelligence to be able to contribute their best toward the whole. Where do you start? Well, it's a good question. There's no one right answer for this, but the one I can stand behind is firstly to meet people where they are. There's so much wisdom in how organizations have evolved to be and how they're set up today. There might be a lot of dysfunction and a lot of ineffectiveness, but it's so important to start by figuring out where you actually are. It's also important, in my opinion, to not just jump in and make changes for the sake of changing things, but rather to identify and prioritize important drivers throughout the organizational system. And not just in the case of S3, of course, but when your current approach fails to bring about the results you expect or wish to see, then to look at what patterns you might pull in that could help. One last thing I think is important, wherever possible at least, is to let people choose their own pace. Unlearning often takes more effort than learning. And under stress, often we tend to revert back more to our habits rather than less. So being considerate of that in matters of change when that's necessary and letting people choose their own pace really helps. Last point, a favorite pattern of mine from S3, one of the most challenging, I think, yet the most simple to understand, is a pattern that we called Artful Participation. I first became aware of this pattern in the noughties. I was working with teenagers at the time. I was a facilitator. And one thing I learned that it didn't matter how skillful I was as a facilitator of these groups. If those kids weren't motivated to give of their best, then we were all going to have a really bad day. So how to engage those kids in a sense of ownership and to really take responsibility for their part and their participation in that team. A great question to ask at any moment you come to think of it is simply whether your behavior in this moment is the greatest contribution you can make to the effectiveness of the collaboration or not. And if it's not, what are you going to do about it? Sometimes this involves holding back and shutting up when you might otherwise speak. And sometimes it involves speaking up, interrupting or objecting, or even breaking agreements, depending on what's the best contribution you can make. And for me, this captures the essence of creating conditions in which people and organizations can thrive, because at the end of the day, this comes down to each individual making that choice to participate, to give their energy and time and effort to something, and to give of their best. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. I'm going to stop my screen.
Great. So any questions? I have a couple, but if anybody has any questions for James, please just go off mute or put it in a chat and I'll read it out, whatever's easier.
Is this a question here? How do we strike a good balance between detailed discovery
Yep.
and converging as we go? How do we strike a good balance between detailed discovery and converge? Let's see. Could you just explain a bit more about that question, please? If you're here.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Oh, okay. Thank you, James. So I think the question was based around requirement gathering. To me, discovery meant requirement gathering at a requirement specification stage. So I wanted to know that because since in an agile environment, we converge as we go, right? So getting so much detailed requirements at the beginning will then maybe oppose agility. Yeah. So my question was based around that, to say, how do we really balance at the beginning?
Yeah, well, I almost want to answer the question with the same question, because I think that's the question people need to ask in each case. Okay, we have to come down somewhere always. And the question is, what would be good enough for now? There needs to be some kind of directionality and some kind of commitment. But depending on the degree of uncertainty around that context, I think would influence how soon you would hit pause, come back to intentionally evaluate whether your assumptions were correct to start with, whether decisions that you made were useful, and so on. So one thing to understand about S3 is we didn't want in any way to tell people what to do. What we wanted was to support people in recognizing the questions that they had and to bring those questions into the consciousness of the organization somehow. And this is why I'd answer that question with the same question. If it's important within the team or within the organization as a whole to be keeping that in mind, then coming together to be able to come to a good enough agreement about how you're going to answer that question for yourselves in your context is probably a priority thing to do.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, James.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Yeah.
And maybe, James, something that comes up and came up in a couple of questions, like this move towards pattern-based structures, right? Like a lot of times people are like, oh, show me the proof, right? Like, where is this? Like, this sounds pretty fluffy in a sense. And, could you maybe talk about just the intent behind these pattern-based approaches rather than just relying on like a cookie cutter recipe, like, either a framework or something like that?
Sure. Well, first of all, just to steelman the idea of a framework, it can be useful to just take an off-the-shelf set of rules and constraints that you upload into your system. Everybody learns the rules or the expectations and follows that and develops skills over time. What concerns me about that approach is it can lead to a lot of waste as well. A lot of frameworks have a significant impact across an organizational system. They might very well be designed upon very good ideas and examples of success, but in some organizational contexts, certain changes are going to lead to more waste rather than more value creation, depending on the context. The downside of a pattern-based approach to change is it means learning about the individual patterns, right? Because you need to actually have some kind of comprehension of that to know when one might be suitable and worth pulling in to facilitate or enable some kind of change. But at the same time, what it enables you to do is keep what's working already, right? Just prioritize areas of need and very specifically make interventions in terms of areas where your current approach is inadequate to bring about the results you expect or wish to see. The other thing is when you make changes in a system, most of the time it's going to lead to many unintended consequences that you couldn't predict. And so taking an iterative and incremental approach to change in response to areas of priority is also going to give you more opportunity to identify some of those consequences and track back more clearly what maybe contributed towards those consequences occurring somehow. So if you can afford the time, and if you are prepared to make the investment into supporting people throughout the organization to become more kind of fluent, more versed in various patterns for collaboration that might be useful for them, then it's quite likely that that's going to give you a much more effective way to approach organizational development and change.